All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Great to have you here for today's webinar, Repurposing Vacant Houses of Worship, Ideas and Opportunities for Economic Development Districts. I'm Brett Schwartz, an Associate Director at the NATO Research Foundation. We're really excited to host this session today. And as you can see from our turnout, there's a lot of interest in this topic that affects communities across the country, large and small. As houses of worship in the US close at an accelerating rate, local governments and economic development districts face both a pressing challenge and a unique opportunity. So today we'll hear from Rick Reinhard, who will explain some of those key trends that are affecting communities and congregations, and share how municipalities and us at economic development districts can engage with religious leaders, congregations, and developers to thoughtfully reimagine these properties. So before I turn things over to Rick, I just want to share a few quick remarks and updates from the NATO Research Foundation. So today's webinar, like so many of our webinars, are brought to you through the Economic Development District Community of Practice. This is a 5-year program funded by our friends at the Economic Development Administration, and we're so grateful for their support for this program. We're about halfway through that 5-year program, and we've provided a wide range of training resources, written materials, networking opportunities, and much more for all of you at EDDs and all the good work that you do. So you can see our website here to access more resources and materials. But again, big thanks to EDA for funding this effort. I know many of you on the call have taken advantage of a lot of the materials that we've developed through the community of practice. There's just a few of them here up on the screen. So we've got webinars related to the SEDS, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. We have publications and briefs related to workforce development, resilience planning, hazard mitigation, aging, and much more. So all these resources are archived for free on our website, as will be this webinar recording afterwards as well. So make sure to head over there when you get a chance. Also just wanted to flag our EDD interactive map, which is available. This, as you can see, is really a directory of all the 400 plus EDDs across the country. It shows their service area, which counties are covered, which EDA region they're in. But for this audience, probably most importantly, also shares a link to the most updated SEDS, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. So this is a great way for you to kind of see what your peers are working on in the world of regional economic development. And to stay up to date on the latest trends and plans. So this map is only as good as the information that's in it, and we rely on all of you to keep us up to date on your latest SEDS planning materials. So if you check out the map and realize that something might be outdated, just shoot us an email, and we'll make sure to update that because we want to keep this map fresh and lively and accessible to all of you. Also, we have a lot of great written resources and materials, but we also have a lot of great opportunities for networking and peer exchange across our network of economic development districts. Up on the screen, you see our 5 online virtual cohorts that we've been working on through the community of practice. Some of them related to new staff at economic development districts. Others are related to sharing best practices around the SEDS. We also have a NATO mentor program, which connects executive directors, those that are more seasoned and experienced, with some new executive directors. So lots of opportunities to get involved in our virtual cohorts. Many of these are already underway, but we have a brand new one that's about to kick off in about 2 weeks, and we're accepting applications for that as we speak. This is a new wealth creation cohort. So wealth creation, of course, a way of looking at economic development through an asset-based lens, building value chains, looking at multiple forms of wealth that exist in your region. So we've got a lot of great material on our website. This is led by my colleague, Melissa Levy. So check that link out if you want to learn more about this cohort and get involved. There'll be a lot of chance to kind of workshop ideas, connect with others, and get some technical assistance as well. And of course, we've got a lot of great virtual opportunities, but nothing beats meeting in person, right? So we're really thrilled that in a couple months, we'll be in Salt Lake City in mid-October for our annual training conference. This is our kind of marquee event of the year that brings together our membership and other partners for 4 days of training, networking, mobile tours, plenaries, receptions, and just a great way to get energized and inspired around the work that we all do around regional economic development. So registration is open and live. Mobile tours have already been announced, and we have an agenda that we're working together that I think you'll really enjoy and really touches on all of the main areas of work of economic development districts and regional development organizations. So hope to see you in Salt Lake in a few short months, and more information available online on our website. And then, of course, to stay up to date on the latest from us at NATO and through the community of practice, please subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. This is NATO News, comes out every Thursday directly to your inbox with updates on funding resources, webinars, best practices, job opportunities, and all sorts of exciting things. So NATO News every Thursday. And of course, stay in touch with me. Reach out if you have any questions about the community of practice, NATO in general, or any of our overall work. So as we transition to today's presentation, a few weeks ago, I saw this chalk art that was on the side of a business in my neighborhood, and thought it really kind of captures the core challenges and opportunities that face us in the field of economic and community development. So, in every region, change will happen. Industries will rise and fall, demographic shifts, new technologies evolve. And we experience different downturns and economic shocks. So communities can't necessarily stop these forces, but they can choose how they respond proactively and shape their own futures. And I think during today's presentation, you're going to hear a lot about change in terms of the growing number of houses of worship that are now or soon will become vacant, which offers both challenges and opportunities to transform and adapt in a positive way. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker to you, Rick Reinhard. I've been following Rick's work for many years. I'm really glad to have him here today to speak in front of all of you at our community of practice. So Rick has worn many hats throughout his career. In addition to being the principal consultant at Niagara Consulting, he served as the deputy executive director of the downtown DC Business Improvement District. He's served as a managing director of urban development and infrastructure finance at the Urban Land Institute, and also previously as a chief of staff to a mayor in Buffalo, New York. Rick's also been very involved in the past half decade with the United Methodist Church on many of the issues that you'll be hearing about today. So as I mentioned, Rick has written quite a lot of articles and materials on these topics, and we're going to make sure to include links to those resources in a follow-up email likely tomorrow that will go out, including the webinar recording and slides from today. So as Rick's presenting, please type any questions you have into the chat, and my colleague Olivia Graham will be monitoring those, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can at the end. So any questions or comments or insights that you have, would love to hear them as we're going through Rick's presentation. So with that, Rick, I'm thrilled to turn things over to you. Thanks again for taking the time to join us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Brett. And thank you also, Olivia and Andrew, for helping with all the logistics here, and to NATO for bringing me in to talk about this really timely topic. Brett mentioned, I'm really one of you all. I spent more than 30 years in local economic development and community development and city management. I ran business improvement districts or like organizations in Richmond, Buffalo, over in the UK, back to Atlanta, and then in DC. And then about, I guess it's almost 10 years ago, I got a call from an acquaintance of mine from Atlanta who had gotten a big Methodist job here in DC as head of the social justice agency for the Global United Methodist Church. And we talked some, and she said, "Are you ready to make a change and come on over and work for the United Methodist Church?" So I did what I call going over to the bright side, I guess, and working for the United Methodist Church. I will say from the get-go, I'm not particularly religious, but I'm very interested in what the UMC and other churches do. And I think it's provided me on this issue with the sort of perspective that the singer Judy Collins had, who sang about both sides now. And I've really been on both sides. I mean, there's a third and fourth side as well of this issue, both from the economic development side and also from the religious side. A few months ago, I went to the church down the street from me. I'm in Rockville, Maryland, just outside of DC. And here's what I saw. I saw a reasonably big sanctuary. Overall, the church has about 20,000 square feet in, I think, 4 buildings. There were 40 people there. I tried to calculate the median age of the folks who were going there. By my calculation, it was about 78. Though Montgomery County is one of the most diverse municipalities in America, it was virtually all white folks who were going there. And when I looked at the church bulletin, there were funerals for, count them, 3 different people who had died that week. And it's really inevitable. If you've been around some looking at churches, this church probably is not going to be around almost no matter what they do 3 or 4 years from now. There's not a huge endowment, I'm sure. And when I asked the pastor the question, have you looked at what you're going to do? Have you looked at what you can do with your surplus, let's say 15,000 square feet? The response was, well, that's too much trouble for us to take a look at. And again, I want to underline, this is not an unusual story. So the fact is, I call these spiritual brownfields, but another way of looking at it is to say that there's a tsunami going across not only America, but also Canada and also Western Europe of emptying out churches. And this is true from denomination to denomination. Almost no religion or denomination is spared. It's true coast to coast. Most experts think we're at the beginning of this, not near the end of it. And my friend Bob Smetana, who's the national reporter for Religion News Service, told my class from the College of William and Mary, which I taught on this last semester, that this great mismatch, and by great mismatch, I mean between small aging congregations on the one hand and large deteriorating buildings on the other hand, is the biggest issue in American religion today. I mean, just think about that for a minute. The national reporter for Religion News Service is saying that this is the biggest issue, but it's kind of behind the scenes. It's a little bit underground. Next. And why is this? Well, what you'll hear from a lot of religious officials is, oh, it's all because of COVID. I would suggest it's more complicated than that. And there's really a perfect storm that's been brewing. First, there's been a massive decline in religious membership. It's gone from 70% of Americans, according to Gallup, who consider themselves to be a member of a congregation, down to 47%. And that's about 2 or 3 year old information, only in one generation. I mean, that's a cataclysmic change. Second, property costs have been going up. It costs something like $7 to $10 a square foot to run a church building. I might actually put that a little upwards. And in particular, the increases have come from insurance and utilities. And that's not including hiring the pastor, buying candles or hymn books or, doing missions or anything like that. Third, and I think third is the most underappreciated point. It used to be when a lot of the houses of worship were built in the United States, particularly those in the Northeast and the Midwest, and in many cases in the Southeast as well, the only way to get to church was to either walk or ride a horse in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, we not only have vastly improved mobility, automobiles, transit, and the like, but we have incredible connectivity. And so if you want to watch the services of the Dalai Lama, all you have to do is to go online and push a button and you can see him. So these, what used to be local churches that in effect had no competition, except from other local churches, are now competing not only with every church, every house of worship in the region, they're competing with every house of worship globally. And then finally, I do think COVID has been a major issue. Next. My friend, Professor Ryan Burge, is an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. And Ryan's the guy on the de-churching of America. As a matter of fact, he's written a book or two on that very issue. So I borrowed these facts and figures from him. When you take a look at, according to his figures, at the share of America who report they have no religious affiliation, it's gone from 5% up to 28%, again, just in a couple of generations. Next. These are the figures of the decline of mainline Protestant denominations, again, over the last 2 generations. And what you'll see, you may not be able to follow the lingo, the initials on each one of these, but just for instance, the one at the very bottom, UMC, is United Methodist Church. The mainline Protestant denominations have gone down, down, and downer over the last 2 generations. Next. With Ryan also collected figures on of those who consider themselves to be members of churches, how many go nearly every week or more. And you'll see those from evangelical, Black Protestant organizations and mainline Protestant have held pretty steady. Evangelicals have gone up a little bit. Catholics have suffered on that a catechismic decline. So what I would say is what Ryan says is that Catholics consider themselves Catholics. They just don't go to church. Next. Data on all of this is few and far between, but I want to give you some anecdotes. I used to work for the United Methodist Bishop of New Jersey, and we rated, R-A-T-E-D, each one of our 530 United Methodist churches in the state of New Jersey. By the way, just think about that for a moment. 530 United Methodist churches in a small state like New Jersey, 700 United Methodist churches in Indiana, 800 in West Virginia, not including the Eastern Panhandle, which is growing. By the way, in Indiana, while there are 700 United Methodist churches, there's only 325 McDonald's there, just to give you a means of comparison. But in the churches that we rated, the 530 churches, we rated them on 10 different factors. We discovered 20% were in critical condition, already should have been closed, 40% in serious condition, right behind, and 40% only in fair to good condition. And I would add the dirty little secret on that 40% is many of those aren't in great shape as well. In the small town of Ottumwa, Iowa, the Main Street manager at the Main Street Now conference told me that small town, most noted for being where Radar O'Reilly from MASH is allegedly from, has suffered 8 closed downtown churches over the last decade or so. Only 3 have been successfully redeveloped, 3 unsuccessfully redeveloped, 2 of those 8 not been redeveloped at all, and he fears that 3 more may be closing. In my old hometown of Buffalo, New York, where I ran the downtown bid and worked as chief of staff to the mayor, among other things, the Roman Catholic bishop just announced the closing of somewhere between 70, if you believe the diocese, 90, if you believe the Buffalo News reporter, Roman Catholic churches in the Buffalo Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church. And folks say, why? Well, what the diocese says, it's because there's not a supply of priests. What I would say is it's because fewer and fewer people have been going to Roman Catholic churches, and they can't support these giant sort of stone buildings. What the US bankruptcy court judge would say, they're closing because he ordered that they close a number of churches to cash in to be able to pay $150 million to plaintiffs who have gotten judgments from the bankruptcy court on sexual abuse lawsuits. Of the 8 Roman Catholic dioceses in the state of New York, 6 have declared bankruptcy because of sexual abuse lawsuits. This is sweeping America with the Roman Catholic Church. And I guess the question is, what the heck do you do in Western New York, the 8-county area, with 70 or 90 closed Roman Catholic churches? And right now, what the city and the counties and state economic development is doing is nothing. So they're going to be having closed churches. Now, to be fair, the market is taking care of some of those. 3 Muslim congregations have bought 3 of the Roman Catholic churches that are closed. There have been a number of immigrants, at least in the past, there have been a number of immigrants, particularly from Burma and Bangladesh, who've come to Buffalo. But in general, folks are doing nothing. the retired now vice president of research and planning for the National Council of Churches, estimates that 100,000 houses of worship may close throughout America over the next decade or so. Next. Well, what do you do about that if you're an economic development official or a mayor or a city manager or whomever? And I look at this as kind of like that Olympic race called the steeplechase. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the steeplechase. Horses do steeplechases, not just Olympic runners. But let's talk about the Olympic race for a minute. They run 3,200 meters. That's about 2 miles. But there's these big hurdles that they have to jump over on the way over and over again. 3 of them are just boards, but one of them has this water jump in it as well. And so what I talk about is that trying to figure out how to reuse and redevelop a house of worship is much like a great steeplechase, except I would argue instead of 3,200 meters, it's more like a 26-mile, 385-yard marathon. But you still got the hurdles and the water in the way. Next. And what are those hurdles? I think there are really 4. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. The first is, what is the property actually like at that church? And what's the property market like in that community? Is it deteriorated? Does it need repairs or replacement? Usually the last thing that congregations continue to fund when they're in trouble is the building itself. A lot of pastors have said to me, and I quote directly, "We are one new roof away from closing." Sometimes these houses of worship, the buildings have mortgages or liens. And one of my favorite things I like talking about is reversion clauses. What's a reversion clause? Well, it means that somebody, usually a family, has donated the land to the church sometime in the 1800s, but with the proviso that if it ever isn't a church, that property reverts to the family that gave the church, no matter how long ago that is. And this is much more common than you might think. Like any other type of property we're talking about, there often are natural or man-made hazards, sewers that have broken, oil tanks, many of them are in floodplains and the like. Another one of my favorite topics is graveyards. I learned through my last 5 years or so that a cemetery is where you bury people that's not adjacent to a church. A graveyard is where you bury people that is adjacent to a church. So I'm talking about graveyards. Most developers, whether they be for-profit or not-for-profit, don't also want to own a graveyard. So in the past, we've had to do things like divide up the property into various lots. We've had to have parking spaces for the graveyard, the ability for folks to visit it, and just to figure out somebody to take care of it. I'll also say, and this is critically important, that the property market in your community is particularly important. All too often, I talk to colleagues who are talking about Manhattan, Miami, Toronto, and San Francisco. And this is almost one issue in municipalities that have really robust real estate markets. I mean, what happens in Manhattan is that developers circle overhead like vultures, just waiting for the church to close so they can descend down and buy it for pennies on the dollar from an unwitting congregation and then turn it into luxury condos. In Ottumwa, in Buffalo, in another one of my favorite places, Palmyra, New York, it's a different story. The story is much more one of, what the heck are we going to do with a dozen empty churches? How are we going to figure out reuses for those? So hurdle number 1, you got to figure out what's the property about and what's the property market like. Hurdle number 2, when I put how, I mean house of worship. The house of worship and the judicatory. Is the church you're dealing with ready for some sort of change? And I don't mean just necessarily closing the church. I often mean reusing the surplus property in the church. And what you'll find is, for the most part, the answer is no, they're not ready for change. All too often, and I turn 70 next month, but all too often, folks who are senior citizens, what they want out of their churches, no matter what they tell you, what they want is to be buried out of that church because they're emotionally tied to the church. It's where their children had their baptisms and confirmations. It's where their parents were buried. It's where they got married. There's a great emotional attachment. The rules of engagement are really important. There are some denominations, the Roman Catholics and the Latter-day Saints would be the prime examples, that are very top down in their management structures and their decision making. So what that means is essentially what the folks in Utah say, or what the bishop in the Vatican say, what they say goes. So they're the decision makers. There are many other denominations that are very, very bottom up. So the Baptists, the United Church of Christ, the Unitarian Universalists, the Jewish faith almost don't have what we call judicatories. That means dioceses, presbyteries, and the like. But the decision is really made by the local congregation. The mainline Protestant denominations, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, are an awful combination between top down and bottom up. So what that means is if you're going to try to get a decision out of any of those, you really need the approval of both the bishop and the treasurer, the folks at, let's call it the diocesan level, and the congregation and the pastor. And often what happens is development entities will spend months and years negotiating, let's say with a pastor, only to find out after those couple years, that's not who needed to approve that. Who needed to approve that was the bishop. Following the money is really important. And that is, there's a spectrum, I call it, between mission on the one hand and money on the other. Some churches want to do whatever they can to extend their mission in the community. And that's great, but a lot of churches really need cash in order to continue going. So I'm working with one church that negotiated for months with the boys club, only to find out near the end of those negotiations that the boys club expected to get the property for improved and for free. Well, you got to figure, are you looking for mission? Are you looking for money? The rules are different when churches merge versus when they close. And another really important thing is it could vary. These projects tend to take time. And it could very well be that by the end of the project, the church hasn't survived. And then what do you do? Next. So that's hurdle number one and number two. Hurdle number three is the neighborhood and the municipality. What's the zoning? And first, what you'll find is the zoning around most churches and municipalities in America is that they are zoned to be churches. There's exceptions to that, but there's the unwritten assumption that a church will always be a church. Well, that means there need to be changes in zoning. Often there need to be other sorts of changes as well. Those changes can engender opposition and the like. Building codes, you'll find, are extremely outdated, particularly when it comes to churches. One church that I did some work with here in the DC area wanted to expand their physical plant by only 1,000 square feet. And what the county in this particular case insisted was, if they were going to expand that 1,000 square feet from something like 20,000 square feet to 21,000, they would have to invest a total of $1 million in a sprinkler system. And so, they didn't, after a while, after hiring the architect and everything, they didn't expand. Preservation ordinances, association rules. Another sneaky one I'll put out are tax policies. Some municipalities just can't wait for churches to close so they can put them on the tax rolls. And I understand that. I mean, again, I was chief of staff to a mayor, but sometimes that can end up screwing up a potential deal. Obviously, what the neighbors think is very important. NIMBY lawsuits can slow things down and stop them. as well from neighborhood associations. And of course, what does the mayor, what do the council members, what do the planners and the like think about it is critical as well. And then finally, the resources. Of course, money. And I want to underline that when we're talking about money, we're really talking about several different kinds of money. First, which is not on my list, is money for what we call pre-development. I mean, that's just sort of kicking the tires and taking a look at things and trying to figure out what can work and not work. Second, money for more traditional pre-development, the architects and the engineers and the soil borings and things like, and the land use attorney, things like that. Next is money for actual development, you know, the bricks and mortar and the like. And then finally, is there money to operate whatever it is that that the plan is to produce? So it's pre-development, development, and operations. And what you'll find on almost any one of these projects, it's particularly true for affordable housing developments, that the money never comes from one place. It tends to come from 5, 6, 7 different places. And the money, the financing has to be put together like a Rubik's Cube from all these different sources, often federal and state and local. And obviously right now, the federal money is very much up in the air with the new administration and the like. It's also, when we're talking about resources, very important to have folks who are good at what they do at church reuse and redevelopment in your region. That means developers, financiers, attorneys, architects, and the like. And what you'll find, I think, particularly in rural America, churches are a real odd duck in order to redevelop. And it typically needs people who've done houses of worship or something like that before. Next. What can be done? And I break things into 3 categories, the 3 R's. The first is to take a house of worship structure. And again, this is not just those that are already empty. This can be ones, that, as you'll hear, that have surplus buildings and or surplus land, but the properties can be reused. And just 3 examples, my friends at St. Paul's United Methodist Church down on the Jersey Shore had a parish hall that was virtually never used. They got together, invested a little bit of money in it, and turned it into community pickleball courts. And they rent those out for community pickleball. They believe it meets their mission because it gets more people familiar with at least the environs around the church. It helps keep the folks there fit, and they charge money for using them. In Iowa City, the First Mennonite Church uses their big, usually empty parking lot for University of Iowa football games. Obviously, Auburn University does the same thing. In the rare occasions I go to Baltimore Orioles games, I more often go to Washington Nationals games. I park at a United Methodist Church in downtown Baltimore and walk a few blocks to the game. A few blocks down the street from me in Silver Spring, Maryland, we've got Veers Mill Baptist Church, and they very proudly host not only their congregation, but 3 other congregations, most of them immigrant congregations in their building. And again, what you'll find with all too many congregations is they don't want to share their space. They don't want other congregations coming in. It's against their rules, it's against their beliefs. But what I would suggest to you is the days of the single-use big stone church on a hill with an iron picket fence all around it and a big empty parking lot and 8 or 10 doors that are locked at least 6.5 days a week, those days are over. Just like single use in most real estate is over with, and we've got to look at mixed uses and multiple uses. The same really has gotten to be true of churches as well. Next. Second thing that can be done is more intense, and that's redevelopment, which is probably what most of you are interested in. And there are some great examples from across the US and Canada and Western Europe. Folks often ask me, well, what can we do with an empty church building? And, the answer is, or even one that has a lot of extra space, the answer is there's pretty much examples where anything has been done. I mean, anything. The hot current thing is to produce affordable housing. But, there are churches that have become brew pubs. There are churches that have become offices. There are churches that have become retail, you name it. But just three examples. First, all across Northern Virginia. And again, Northern Virginia is a very robust real estate market. Churches partnering with not-for-profit development corporations have developed affordable housing on the church property. In some cases, the church owns it. In some cases, the church has done a joint venture. In some cases, the church has done a land lease. In some cases, the church has sold it to a developer. It all depends. And I would argue that any one of those models can really work. In some cases, the church has been demolished. And again, in this case, we're not talking about churches that are on the National Register of Historic Places getting demolished. We're talking about pretty unexceptional cinder block churches from the late 50s and early 60s in Northern Virginia. So in some cases, the churches have been demolished and rebuilt, and the church leases back some space in there. In some cases, the church has been preserved. In the one in the picture, the church has been demolished. It's an entirely new development, but the church owns the church, and the not-for-profit Affordable Housing Development Corporation owns the apartments. Second, on a much larger scale in Louisville, St. Peter's United Church of Christ, working with a United Church of Christ church building and loan fund, has put together a really big project in what was a relatively tough part of Louisville that's called the Village at West Jefferson. In addition to the church, which has been preserved, it's 30,000 square feet of commercial development. The neighborhood needed a bank and a restaurant and all sorts of other things there as well. In Charlotte, a developer came in a very high-end part of town, a potentially high-end part of town, and did a $200 million redevelopment. Next. And the third R is recycling, meaning sales. Sometimes churches, houses of worship, denominations just decide to sell their space. In downtown Tampa for $5 million, in downtown Seattle for $32 million, in downtown Miami for $55 million. And in some cases, the church, again, has bought back space in the overall development in order to have their church there. Next. States have been passing laws more and more to make it easier for faith-based institutions to produce affordable housing. Washington State, California, Maryland, and Oregon have actually passed such legislation, and those are in operation. And it's being considered, or has been considered, in 8 other states, some of them conservative states. And those may get passed later this year or next year. Next. Similarly, municipalities have either constructed programs or have passed legislation to incentivize faith-based institutions to produce primarily affordable housing. Seattle, Portland, Pasadena, Atlanta, Charlotte, where I live, Montgomery County, being an example of those. These have all passed, I'd say, in the last year or two. So it's a trend. Next. Again, the big trend these days is to take faith properties and turn them into affordable housing. What I would argue, and one of my articles talks in detail about this, sometimes that makes sense when you look at the 4 hurdles, sometimes it doesn't. And I cringe a little bit when folks try to shoehorn affordable housing into every single potential faith development. Next. Last slide. Going ahead in the future, there are some things we really need to consider, big picture things. First, everybody needs to understand the huge scope of this problem. We're not talking about one church here and another church there. We're talking about almost probably 100,000 houses of worship just across the US. Second, houses of worship, which are bad about real estate. I mean, almost unanimously, they're bad. They're not schooled in it. Really need to figure out, like railroads did in the last century, how to get into the real estate business. Third, as I mentioned, we need a new mixed use model for houses of worship. Fourth, municipalities and development agencies need to look now at zoning, building codes, and property tax policies. And then finally, we need more money to do this. It takes money, it takes stable money, and tax breaks and the like at the federal and state and local level. So let me take a breath, and I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, Rick, thank you so much for your presentation. Really inspiring, informative, and it looks like the chat is starting to take off with some questions. So I'm going to turn things over to Olivia to guide us. We've got about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So Olivia, turn it to you.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions coming in, but one of the first ones that came in, which has some upvotes as well. So some people are curious about it. Some examples that you've come across from more rural areas specifically.
Well, I think often in a rural area, folks can get overwhelmed by there's 4, 5, 6 houses of worship that are closing. And I think it's really important to try to figure out which are the lowest hanging fruit, or which is the lower hanging fruit, and really go after that. And when I say lower hanging fruit, I mean looking at all 4 of the hurdles. I mean, honestly, there are some congregations that are too difficult to work with right now, and it'll work, a lot better doing it somewhere else. So I think that's really important. I mean, what I would say to you is there's examples across America on this. Sometimes in Palmyra, New York, near where I grew up in Syracuse. Palmyra, by the way, is where the Latter-day Saints religion was founded by Joseph Smith. But there's 4 mainline Protestant churches at the 4 corners of the downtown, and 2 are open but struggling. One, a traditional Baptist church has closed, but everyone worked on getting a more non-denominational type church in there, and that seems to be going okay. But the 4th church was bought by Latter-day Saints folks from Utah, who have turned the whole thing, both the parsonage and the church, into a giant Airbnb. And typically it's rented by folks from the Latter-day Saints Church who come to Palmyra to tour Hill Cumorah. Having these changed into residences is not necessarily that unusual. So, creative folks can take an old small church in a small town and turn it into their house. However, I think one of the things that's really important is to make sure that the zoning, the building codes, et cetera, don't get in the way of doing that, and that these folks have their hands held the whole way. It's also not unusual that churches, I mean, today, houses of worship often have food pantries, clothing closets, health clinics, childcare centers being operated informally out of the church space. It's not unusual that churches can be transformed into not-for-profit offices that host those things. One of the problems that many municipalities face is, I mean, I can tell you one church in New Jersey, we only had something like 12.5 folks going there on Sunday, and we would have closed it. But twice a week, there was a feeding program, a food distribution program, I should say, out of there that fed something like 1,000 people a week. It wasn't just those 12.5 folks staffing it. It was folks from throughout the community So, we were trying to figure out, and there was no good answer. Well, what do we do about this? We don't want to close this in the community. It would be very unchurch-like to do that. So another, so housing is one use. Another use is not-for-profit offices. And, it's not unusual that sometimes they get turned into restaurants or brew pubs or something like that. But what I will tell you is there's no magic answer to this.
Thanks, Rick. That question on rural areas is from Lisa Dawson. Thank you, Lisa. And our next one is from Candace Payne asking, so you mentioned a vacant church list, a list of vacant properties. Do you know where they can find that?
Where's a list of vacant properties? I normally go to, God, I'm just blanking out on it. But there's two websites on commercial properties. Y'all probably know what they're called, online. They're sort of like Zillow, except they're for commercial properties. If anyone can help me with the names of those. But you have to search for churches. And it's a really interesting exercise to go to these websites, just doing searches for commercial properties, search for churches, and then see what comes up in your state. Because you'll find, I guess if you were to take a look at Maryland right now, you'd probably find about 20 churches for sale. But I want to caution you, it isn't just the ones that have closed and that are currently on the market. It's those that are about to close. In a small city in Northern Virginia, sort of Northwest Virginia, a planner came up to me after the American Planning Association conference and said, we're really interested in putting in an auditorium, like an arts and cultural center. We've been talking about building a new one. Does it make sense to take an old church and renovate that? This is a historic town. And I said, oh, by all means. And he said, how can we get the information on it? And I said, put on a fake nose and glasses and mustache and go sit in the back of each one of the churches on a given Sunday and just look around. I mean, look around at, do you think the acoustics in here would work? Is it the right size? But also look around and see if there's 15 people there and the median age is 80. This one probably isn't going to be around very long. And then it's important to be able to negotiate with, on the one hand, the congregation and pastor, on the other hand, the judicatory and the bishop. So, what you want to do is try to get ahead of this. I've been talking to folks in a part of Cleveland, big city, but not downtown, who reported to me that one of their 6 churches closed. And what I said to them is, get prepared for 4 of the other 5 to close. And I said, which ones? I said, oh, I have no idea. But this is just what's going on out there right now. So first, develop relationships with the folks in these churches. Municipalities and development agencies tend not to know their churches and vice versa. And second, develop some data on what these are, because I'm telling you, this is going to be the #1 issue facing your town center anyway over the next 10 years or so. It's what department stores were 20 and 30 years ago, or big stores, except the churches are much more difficult to reuse because of their architecture and because of the emotion involved.
So the next question that came in is about other faiths that might be experiencing similar declines. So the question is, are other faiths other than the ones you mentioned in your presentation experiencing similar membership or congregation declines, and are their houses of worship closing at the same rate?
The answer, some are doing better than others. So what you'll find is that there's been a growth in non-denominational churches, but that's tended to be among a few really big non-denominational churches, and the smaller ones are not necessarily doing all that well. The Muslim religion tends to be doing well. The Orthodox Jewish religion tends to be doing well. In general, immigrant religions are doing a lot better than, good old-fashioned, US sorts of religions, because you'll find it's a way in order to really get identity. So just a really crazy number. Of the 530 United Methodist churches in the state of New Jersey, 3 of the top 4 were Korean United Methodist churches. I mean, that sort of boggles the mind. The largest Episcopal church in the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia is a Hispanic Episcopal church, and 70% of that church is Bolivian. I didn't know there were that many Bolivians around DC, to be honest, but it's because it's a place for folks to get their identity and mix and match with each other. So a lot of times, to go back to an earlier question, if we're talking about what to do with an emptying mainline church, I mean, be it Catholic or Protestant, sometimes the things to do is to reach out to immigrant churches and figure out some sort of way to broker a deal. It could be in sharing the church. It could be in taking over the church. There's one here, again, in Rockville, Twinbrook Baptist Church encouraged a Hispanic church to meet there. Twinbrook Baptist was closing. They decided to sell the church to the Hispanic community for 1/2 of market value. They took the rest of the money and gave it out to the community as grants, not just to religious organizations, but to SPCAs and food organizations and things like that, which is a really, really good solution, I think. So, and I can't remember, they may have had to hold the paper on that, because a lot of these, a normal bank does not necessarily like financing kind of speculative churches.
All right, our next question is a specific one about the Autumna, Iowa example that you gave, asking how they were repurposed and what it is that they're being used for now.
This is from a couple years ago. I don't really remember all the details, but kind of the usual suspects, meaning not-for-profit offices, a residence, a for-profit office, and the like. Some worked out, some didn't work out, and again, this is what's going on out there right now. I wish I had the details. I don't have them.
We have another question, and it looks like a few folks are interested in this, about specific federal or state funding, so public funding resources that could aid and help out rural communities, specifically with rehabbing some of these properties, if you're familiar with any of those.
First, what I'll say is the federal government is very much up in the air. Under the former administration, they asked me to chair/facilitate a group at HUD about all of this. Then the administration changed. I've met with not with the secretary, but with 3 of the folks who report to the secretary at HUD. Actually, when I did my William and Mary class, we went in and met with them in a great meeting. And what I discovered was, on the one hand, they really, really want to help churches. I mean, this is on their radar screen, the new administration, particularly the new HUD administration. Unfortunately, both at HUD and at some other agencies, they're doing away with or threatening the very programs that allow churches to do this. So I think the dust just needs to settle a little bit on this. And I think it's, to some degree, they are beginning to realize what programs are needed to help churches do this. Low-income housing tax credits, which are not out of HUD, they're actually out of the Department of the Treasury. Those are among the favorites, but obviously it only works if you're looking at low-income housing. Federal historic preservation tax credits can work when there are historic properties. In the past, there was a holdup with that, which was that the historic preservation tax credits usually required you to keep the sanctuary the way it was. Well, normally folks don't need a big sanctuary when they're redeveloping a church. They need a small one, or they need to chop it up into housing or offices and the like. Under the last administration, there's been some easing of that requirement. often state historic tax credits follow the federal historic tax credits, doing whatever can be done. And beyond that, folks just try to cobble together whatever they can. You'll find that in communities that are desperate for affordable housing, some are, some aren't so desperate, that most municipalities will go out of their way to help figure out what to do to help fund this. Sometimes what it means, though, is that an individual church or a adjudicatory need to, in effect, throw the land into the deal or sell the land for greatly below market rate in order for, let's say, the affordable housing to work. That's not unusual. So when a house of worship goes into one of these deals, particularly in the heartland, I'll say, with stars in their eyes, normally it just doesn't work that way.
Great. Thanks, Rick.
That's-
Olivia, I think, is that all the
That seems to be all the questions, unless we
Excellent.
have, yeah.
That's
anything
good. We're at
else
the top of the hour. So Olivia, thank you so much for moderating that session. Rick, big thank you to you for sharing your expertise and your enthusiasm on this topic. I think just from the chat and the turnout today, there's a lot of interest here around this. And I think a lot of the issues you raised certainly intersect with so much that our EDDs and other regional development organizations are working on. So big thank you for kind of generating this conversation. We haven't really had a discussion like this before with our group, specifically about houses of worship.
Right.
So thank you so much for that.
Well, and
Yeah,
let me add, I have a 10-page Word document that's a list of resources. Anyone who wants to send me an email, and I'm sure you'll send them my email,
Yeah.
I'm glad to just turn it right around and send you that as an attachment. I'm not very swift when it comes to other things on the web, but I'm more than glad to send you the Word document. And it's every doggone article you've ever wanted to know about reuse and redevelopment of houses of worship.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Rick, you've been extremely generous with your time and your knowledge. And so, yeah, so everyone keep an eye out tomorrow. We're going to send an email out with the recording for this, with slides, with Rick's contact information, and also some other recent resources for you to continue to follow up. So with that, as you close out today, there'll be a short pop-up that'll come on the screen, give us a little bit of feedback on today's session, as well as other future topics you'd like to explore. As I mentioned, we're about halfway through, a little over halfway through this community of practice, and we want to continue to be able to provide resources and information on topics that are important to you and your community and your region. So Rick, Olivia, everyone, thank you again for joining us, and all of you have a great rest of the day. Keep an eye out for that email tomorrow with more information, and we'll see you next time. Great. Thanks again, Rick.
Thank you.